All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so where do we leave off? So, like I said, so blacks were doing all kind of great things during this time, and like I said, with Hamilton, part of the issue with the democracy is that it was never intended for everybody to have a vote. Now, while Hamilton wasn't necessarily making a distinction or a clear delineation between blacks and whites for this point. Anybody who was not an elite, he felt wasn't worthy of the process for democracy, for voting. And that's really where he and a lot of the old guard stood. So this kind of not allowing or barring people from voting actually affected quite a few whites, especially if you did not own land. So unless you were a land holding, owning white man, you were excluded from that process anyway. But even as the laws began to slowly change to include, non-land holding white men, many of those statutes and limitations continue to exist to bar black men, free black men, from voting. Now, while there was not a concerted effort from the federal government at this point to say, blacks can't vote, black men, free black men can't vote, but many of the states, and remember we just talked about the nullification crisis and the doctrine of nullification, where the states were saying if we don't like something that the federal government says or is doing, we can do our own thing. Well, one of those things extended to whether or not free black men were able to vote. So in areas like Virginia in the late 1700s, 1762, they passed an actual law barring Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians from voting even if they did own property. Okay, same thing in North Carolina. So in the South, you're starting to see that really happening. By 1835, their constitutional amendment was passed that ended the rights to vote for all black men in the states. Because again, up until that point, free black men could exercise that right to vote. So we start to see again this targeted systematic oppression to stop black men from being able to vote. And that wasn't just in the South. Of course, in the Midwest and the northern states, they continued to have property requirements only for black men, okay? And states that we were coming into after the Louisiana Purchase, as new states began to charter themselves as, states within the Union, like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. As they came in, they actually put laws in their state constitutions that only white men could vote. So so like I said, from the federal standpoint, you didn't see an all-out barring of black men from the polls until the Dred Scott incident comes, and that's going to be another 25 years. But even before that, you're seeing precedent set that was trying to suppress black men from being able to exercise their rights to vote. Okay. Now, one of the things, like I said, that became a real issue for, when they were trying to fly this kite about the alleged inferiority of blacks. So what they start trying to do is, because in the face of all these inventions, you've got Biddy Mason, you've got Cuffy, you've just got laundry list of, blacks who were exceeding in every area. Okay, so you could no longer just blanketly tell that lie of intellectual superiority over blacks. So you start coming with the next thing, saying, oh well, part of the reason some of them are being able to make some of these strides is because they're not fully Negro, they're not completely black, which comes back into the issue or the point we were making very early on in the semester, that the seed actually determines the race, if you will, of the child. So it's not about what the mother is, it's about what the father is. Now, do we respect and honor the mother? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's the father, and remember we talked about any you can take and do this with any seed, a bag of lemon seeds, some watermelon seeds, kiwi seeds, whatever seed you have. It doesn't matter what earth you plant it in, what's going to grow is what the seed is. Period. And there's no mixed, fruit like that. It unless you're Monsanto and, the Frankenfruit. But I digress. But in nature, right, whatever that seed is, that's what's going to determine what fruit grows. Now, why is that important? Again, because a lot of the like I said, the blacks, so you have, what they would call Negroes at that time. You had Negroes, and then you had people who were half Negro, half, in this case, mostly French, and they would call them mulattoes. So that's somebody who's half one thing, half the other. Now we know, again, whatever your father is what you are. But for the sake of the classifications that they were using, so somebody who was half one thing and half another was considered to be mulatto. Okay? Now, a person who was 1/4 black, because they counted how much black you had, not how much white you had. It was how much black you had. So if you had a quarter black, which means, let's say, for instance, your grandfather was a black man and your grandmother was a French or European, white woman, you would be considered your father would be considered a mulatto. But then let's say your mulatto father marries a white woman, right? So then you would be considered quadroon. So 1/4, which is quad, right? So you're 1/4 black, a quarter black. So that's where you would hear the term, especially around Louisiana and in areas where they still spoke a lot of French, because that's where these terms kind of come from. Quadroon. You may have even heard of the quadroon balls, things like that. So that was another classification. Now, let's say, for instance, you as a quadroon now marry someone who's white, right? Your children would then be called, you guessed it, octoroon, 1/8 color. So roon is actually, it just means color. Okay, that's just, a French term word for color. So you are 1/8 color. So octo being 8, so you're octoroon, okay? Or quadroon or mulatto. So why are these designations significant? Because here comes some fun parts. Now you have a group of people who, again, they're free, and most of these people with like I said, the octoroon, barely roon, mulatto, whatever, they are typically, not 100%, but typically the product of a white man and a black mother. That is very, very, very important, because again, you are what your father is. So even before Toussaint, one thing about the French, remember we talked about how they would relate to their slaves and the blacks, the natives, whatever. When they had children with these, black or Native American women, in many cases they actually acknowledged their children, gave them certain privileges, some education, different things like that. Not 100% of the time, but in quite a few instances. So now you have a group of, for purposes of practicality, black or mulatto people, even though their fathers are white, so they are actually white, but because they have color, they are not considered having all the privileges of being white. So when they come over to, when they started fleeing and coming over into the US in particular, they were trying to establish themselves as a different class or a different race because they didn't really want to be associated with the regular free blacks, because many of the folks who were coming also from, Haiti coming over, they were actually fully black as well. So there was a significant number of them, but there were also people, like I said, who were, so-called mixed. Now, what can you do with these people? Well, you can use them. Yes, you can use them because their sensibilities are to distance themselves from the other blacks because they don't consider themselves to be black. They consider themselves to be something different. So you can capitalize on that by putting them in positions as what we would call gatekeepers now. Gatekeepers or taskmasters, the boule. I don't know if some of you are even familiar with some of these terms, the black boule. So basically what you had was a lot of mixed race, if you will, folks who were being put in positions over the rest of the blacks, but 90% of the time, their interest and what they were after did not reflect the values or the interest of the blacks they were put over. And that's going to come into make a lot more sense when we come into Reconstruction after the Civil War. But just to set the stage for that, so you've got these class stratifications based solely on color, right? So a color caste system within a caste system, all right? And that was going to be really pushed even more by a gentleman named Willie Lynch. Willie Lynch, Lynch. That's actually where the term lynching comes from, is from his name. But Willie Lynch wrote a paper and shared his theories on how to break slaves mentally. So by pointing out differences between, so the old against the young, the men against the women, you give certain privileges to, someone who is lighter in complexion while further mistreating someone who's darker in complexion, or vice versa. So all of these different differences were going to be exploited and used for control. Remember, we talked about the tools of conquering, which is divide and conquer. That was one of them. So that's how, a lot of that went down. So that psychological mind game of pitting blacks against each other based on superficial, type things. So that was going on. So you end up, like I said, with all these different classifications. So like I said, a caste system within a caste system. All right, so now let's back up a little bit to Mr. Andrew Jackson. So a few things I definitely wanted to touch base on with him. Now, I know I mentioned in class, he was truly the poster boy for the, the rugged, everyman kind of archetype, during that time. So the idea of this, the way we've romanticized and characterized American masculinity, especially as we move towards the West. So the cowboy, the strong, stoic, firm but fair, type of rugged guy, from the West and the on the plains and the frontiersmen, so that ideology started to really shape, part of our cultural and national identity, even to today. America's favorite team, basically, the Cowboys, right? But what's funny about that is that in reality, the majority of the Cowboys, and how we even call them cowboys in the first place, were mostly black and Mexican. Boy was a diminutive term that they would use as an insult. So the ranchers, the farm hands, the cattle workers, or whatever, that was a cowboy. Okay. So, but it was kind of, that term was taken over and then romanticized as, the strong, silent, good looking, rugged white guy, out there wrangling the horse, riding the horses and wrangling the cows. Right. So I mentioned, think people like John Wayne. Go back and take a look. If I get an opportunity, I might show a little clip just to familiarize some of you with who he was. But great movies, great actor. And a lot of his movies were in glorious black and white early on because, he was part of that era, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and he really was kind of the on-screen version of what they started with Andrew Jackson. Now, again, he was selected because of his kind of wild card, rugged appeal, right? And in a time where the majority of the countrymen, the voting, white men, they were very, very skeptical and becoming very disillusioned with the old guard of politicians, right? Because they had nothing in common with them. These, old white men with money and land and so forth, weren't really concerned with them and their, needs and so forth. So they selected him. And this is where I wanted to get into controlled opposition. All right, write that term down. Controlled opposition. Because what you are going to discover is that this illusion of choice has always been embedded in our democratic process. Okay? So what you do is, that the people are not going to keep going for your back east dandies as politicians running everything. That dog is not going to hunt. No, we're going to have to stop that. So what I do is I go select somebody who I can control. And how do I do that? I choose this poor boy, never had anything, but he's a rugged, kind of, like I said, to pull yourself up by your bootstrap kind of thing, every man. So the masses really could identify with Andrew Jackson. So the powers that be went ahead in 1805 and inducted him into one of the oldest lodges in North America in 1805. So what happened as soon as he got inducted? Immediately, if not sooner, his real work, if you will, began. They sent him down into Florida to try and stop the Seminoles, down there. Of course, that didn't really work very well. But they also then had him meet up with a group of rogue Cherokee men, which again were not the authorized chiefs or anything like that. They were not. In fact, it was a few of the guys. One, his name was Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and his Elias Boudinot, which was his nephew, and Stand Watie, also Major Ridge's nephew. So Ridge, his son, and two of his nephews, right, went ahead and sold all of the land west of the Mississippi to the United States, under Jackson. Well, Jackson knew good and doggone well that these people didn't have any authority to do that. However, deceit is the name of the game. That's another tool in their arsenal. So they wielded it and they, took the land. And then once they had seized the land, they just rounded the people up and put them on the Trail of Tears. Didn't give them any opportunity to really get themselves outfitted for a journey like that, of that magnitude. So, unfortunately, between disease, exposure to the elements, and good old-fashioned starvation, over 4,000 Cherokee died, with a large number of them being women, children, and the elderly. the most vulnerable, groups, right? So all of this is going on, and you've got a lot of people who are hailing Jackson for what he's done. Yeah, you remove those Indians. Yeah. So they can open up this land and settle it and move into it, etc. So, that would be one of those presentism things where some people would say, well, if I'm looking back on it, if I'm saying how wrong that was now, but at the time, do we consider that to be wrong? Well, it was wrong then, and many people knew it was wrong at that time. So, so you had a lot of that going on. So, Beyond the Trail of Tears, there is a nice little video that's in there. Do check that video out. In the slide presentation, I believe it's part of that. And go and check that out, or just pop on YouTube and take a look at, some of the, it don't have to be a long one, but just really get a good, to really familiarize yourself with some of the major points of the Trail of Tears. But that's an overview. So let's move on to talking about the railroads very early on. So infrastructure, back again to that. So with the early railroads, because one of the biggest things that you need to do when you are, you've just, like I said, doubled the size of the country, right? So now you need to be able to move people, goods, services, products. You've got to be able to move these things. We already talked about the steamboats and how, yes, that did a great thing for cities up and down the Mississippi River like St. Louis. However, you also had to have transcontinental things that were moving, from east to west, not just north and south, okay? So railroads are coming into play here. So when you're talking about that type of infrastructure, it's going to cost some money. Well, where is this money coming from? You've got a few local investors, absolutely. Some people who are, local, mostly back east, moneyed people who are definitely going to invest in laying the track. And, because of course it's to their benefit, clearly, because most of them are merchants and have products that they want to see moved, transcontinentally, right? So they want this. Some of it is also through bonds where, so as railroads are growing, funding is going to start relying more and more on bonds that are issued and sold to investors in eastern cities and in Europe, particularly Britain. So once again, good old Mother England is over here investing into the very infrastructure of America. Okay? So railroad companies, they're using assets like land, locomotives, and rolling stock as collateral. So they're, putting up their trains, even if you will, to as collateral to get the funding from these either private investors or from the British. Okay. Excuse me. Now, that's how they were raising some of the money, but that doesn't tell you, where are you getting the land from? Okay. Enter in eminent domain. Eminent domain. What is eminent domain? So, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution allows private property to be taken for public use with just compensation, right? So, in short, if there's a project, a civil works project, civic works project, that's for the greater good of the community, the government can take your land and throw you a few pennies and claim that that's a fair, that it's a fair amount. Now, one of the things I want to point out in particular is that a lot of the areas that they were targeting to take the land, you guessed it, was owned by free blacks. Also, not exclusively just free blacks, but a good number of free blacks, but also from undesirable immigrants. So remember how we've been talking about how there was a very anti-Catholic sentiment. So many of your Irish immigrants, your some of your German immigrants, even if you were Catholic, and you know what they did, they even passed an alien and sedition law against the French. So if you were still trying to be here, holding on to your land, and you were Catholic, if your property, and they would oftentimes map it that way, would go straight through the communities where you own property, and they would seize it and give you a couple of dollars. It was absolutely bananas, how they would do that. So, and we do understand that even today, owning land, just like then, was a step towards generational wealth, right? And money is a defense. So having property, having, resources, was a defense. Well, if you want certain communities and certain groups of people defenseless, this is partially how you do it. And that went on clear into the early 20th century, and when we really get into the Rockefellers and all these people. Wanted to definitely hit that up. Also, I don't know if I completely told you about controlled opposition. I know I started it, but I can't remember if I finished that particular piece. But controlled opposition is when you set somebody up to, or something, or a system or person in place to oppose the status quo. But in actuality, you control that opposition. So Andrew Jackson is a sterling example of controlled opposition. So you built him up. His PR, that came out, all his press releases showed him as kind of the everyman, down to earth, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, the rhetoric, like he identifies with the regular person. He wasn't born rich. He was poor from an immigrant family. All of the things, right, that makes people who are boots on the ground believe, now he's somebody that is going to understand what I've got going on. He's going to understand the plight that I am in. Well, he was bought and paid for by the Freemasons. So everything that he had to do was going to really be in line with the agenda of the Freemasons. Okay? And like I said, when we get to that lesson on Tuesday, all of that's going to make even more sense, I promise. But this is sort of the setup. So some of the things I just wanted to make sure that we all